Greetings all, and welcome to episode 1 of MythAppropriation. This is going to be a discussion of materiality, mythos systems, and human culture. My name is Christian Haunton. I am an anthropologist and a university lecturer, and my research focus is in religion and material culture. I called this episode 1. I genuinely don't know whether there'll ever be another episode of this. The reason I'm making this video is because some recent news events have left me feeling like there's something I want to say or some things I want to discuss, and I don't really have a great venue for it. So I'm setting this up as a place to talk about these things, and if nothing else, it'll provide that opportunity. The situation I'm talking about has to do with the Slender Man stabbings that happened about 2 weeks ago now. If you're not familiar with this news story, I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. I'll link to it with an annotation, and you can follow up on it on your own. If you're watching this video, there's a pretty good chance you've already heard this because it's broadly available news. The broad strokes of the case are 2 preteen girls stabbed a third friend of theirs 19 times in the woods in an attempt to either placate or please in some way the Slender Man, the fictional YouTube phenomenon called Slender Man. And this has led to a lot of people who had never heard of Slender Man coming out to do news reports and so forth, and to do investigations, a lot of online articles, a lot of mainstream like network news articles or network news broadcasts about it. And a lot of good materials come out of it, but a lot of it has missed some really critical points about the Slender Man, and the Slender Man mythos particularly, that I think are worth talking about at a time like this, especially since there is a fair deal of hand-wringing that's going into this. So anyway, I'm not going to delve again particularly into the Slender Man mythology either, because my assumption is if you're watching this video, you probably have a pretty good sense of it. Again, you can just check out Wikipedia or Know Your Meme or something like that. I'll provide some annotations and get the broad strokes there. But the things that generally are important to understand for the discussion I want to have about it are that this is a meme, an internet phenomenon, that originally began with a pair of photographs, a pair of photoshopped photographs on a forum where the goal was to make a creepy story, to make monsters to scare one another with. That was the stated goal, and this is a very successful version of that, done by a gentleman named Eric Knudsen under the name Victor Surge on the Something Awful forums a few years ago. Now, even though Victor Surge was the one to create these photos and some subsequent photos that helped flesh out this story, he was also the one to use the name the Slender Man. The phenomenon carried over into a variety of other media, particularly other people making photos, but then blogs, slender blogs as they're typically called, and ARGs, or alternate reality games, on YouTube, which essentially amounted to video narrative series on YouTube. Marble Hornets being the most prominent of these, Everyman Hybrid, Dark Harvest, and the fourth escapes. Tribe 12 are the big 4 that did this. And then eventually it became a video game called Slender the 8 Pages, and then a subsequent kind of expansion of that game, a more robust version of that game, or sequel if you want to, called Slender the Arrival, which again, if you've heard of the Slender Man, you probably know about all these factors. But the important issue here is that no single person created the Slender Man mythos. No single person really determined even his visual style, because Victor Surge, who created the original photos, he imagined him as somebody who had a face, and that face simply didn't appear on film, whereas most of the subsequent versions have had him as a blank-faced figure, dressed in a suit and tie, always. Usually black tie, black suit. And by the way, just so you're clear, the Slender Man fits into a long kind of narrative tradition, or visual tradition at least, of these sorts of menacing creatures. The tall man in the dark suit, or dark formal clothing of some sort, often with a distorted face, missing features, or with monstrous features and so forth. The film Phantasm has a character called the Tall Man. In fact, most of these characters are named the Blank Man. I believe next, chronologically, was probably Ben Yahtzee Crowshaw's Chuzo Mythos, which had a character also usually called the Tall Man, or Kabadath, I think is the character's name eventually given, who was very literally just looked like the Slender Man, but in an Elizabethan sort of formal attire rather than a 20th century formal attire. Buffy the Vampire Slayer had the Gentleman in the episode Hush, and those all predated the Slender Man phenomenon. Since that's come out, by the way, this has continued. Doctor Who had the Silence and the Whisper Men, which are both visually very similar to the Slender Man. And also, it's probably worth saying that there's really no way that the modern Slender Man mythology could exist without the Lovecraftian, the Cthulhu mythos, that sort of background being part of our cultural milieu. I would argue that, at least. Slender Man has a real sense of the otherworldly, the outsider, the being from another place whose intentions are not clearly understood. In fact, he used to be regularly drawn with tentacles, as a man in a suit and a blank face, but also with tentacles coming out of him, often dark, shadowy, tenebrous. And so, I think there's no doubt that that was in the background of the mind of a lot of people doing this. In fact, you can see that in some of the narratives that have developed around it, a real kind of connection to this idea of lost gods and cultures and so forth that worship things from outside our dimension or outside our space, and this being kind of a holdover from that. So that's background, but what does that have to do with this stabbing? And by the way, I should probably expand upon this. I'm filming this on June 12th, and at this time at least, there's been another stabbing, or a stabbing attempt, I think, in Ohio that's been sort of rolled into this. In fact, there's been a shooting in Nevada that was also sort of rolled into this because they had sort of pseudo connections to the Slender Man, or to people who at least had an interest in the Slender Man. And so there's been sort of a media attempt to turn this into an epidemic or an outbreak or something like that. I don't think that's really accurate. Time's going to tell. But I think we'll find that that's not really the case. That's just sort of sensationalism and an attempt to stir this into something a little different than it is. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the specific incident of these two young girls stabbing the third girl. The reason that this is worth delving into in a, I think, slightly different direction than some of the news media have dealt with it is that there's a really important mythological element, a mythos that goes into the Slender Man, and that feeds the kind of thinking that we can see resulting in an event like this, or in a crime like this. Slender Man is part of a larger body of what's called fake lore sometimes, and a subset of that called creepypasta, which is a very internet-specific form of fake lore. The idea is just stories made up to be like folklore. Stories made up to sound like they are real stories. Now, that gets a little bit tricky because most of us, I think, will probably agree that all folklore is made up to a certain extent. It may have a kernel somewhere where it relates to something that actually happened, but the way it has become folklore is by people embellishing that and adding things to it that didn't literally happen, in fact, that often couldn't literally happen. And that's what makes it a mythology, a folklore, a mythos, a story, rather than a historical event or a fact. In terms of the Slender Man, we want to look at why he, or it, I suppose, is as popular as it is compared to the larger body of this sort of material that's come out. Slender Man isn't the only modern folklore, he certainly isn't the only creepypasta, but he is the one that has taken off to a degree that others haven't. And I think it's as simple as looking at some of the factors involved in what he's telling people. Mythology, any mythos system, it only functions, it only survives if it says something to people that they are interested in hearing or that they think may be true. And so whenever you see something successful, it's worth looking at what this is saying. And I think the Slender Man is saying something very particular for a digital age. I talked about this at a convention I spoke at of Lovecraft fans in Providence about a year ago, a little less than a year ago. And what I brought up is that the Slender Man is literally a representation of the faceless man on the internet who is a risk to our children, who is a threat to our children. Children feature regularly in the Slender Man mythology, less so in the video versions, the YouTube ARG versions, because having child actors is more complicated than just doing something with your friends. And so those have tended away from that mythology. But the original mythology of the Slender Man, and one that has continued throughout a lot of versions of it, is that he has some particular interest in children, that he either takes children or infects children or in some way harms children by his presence. And that is a modern digital age fear, that there is a faceless person on the internet out there waiting, looking for an opportunity to take or hurt or abuse your child in some way. And the Slender Man speaks to that. I think there's another factor which is probably worth setting aside for this discussion, but I'll bring up as a note at least, that he also can kind of represent the faceless suit. Right? He wears a suit and has no face, and that is something that we are acutely aware of, I think, in the modern world, particularly in the modern technological world, that there are these faceless suits out there making decisions for us that we don't necessarily like, and that often those come to us through our internet, whether it's hating the new user interface for some program you've used for years, or having dramatic changes made to user agreements, or things like that. There are suits out there that we can never reach, but they can reach us. They can touch us with their tentacles that reach out into all parts of life. Now, I don't think any of that is literal. I don't think anybody, Victor Surge or any of these other people, thought, you know, this would be a good myth about the modern human condition, so I'll write it down. But I do think that's why it's stuck. When you throw something out there, some of it's going to get well received, and some of it's going to get very quickly forgotten. And the Slender Man was well received. So, alright, Slender Man is communally created. He is popular to the extent that the public, or a certain portion of the public, finds the idea accessible, interesting, worth learning more about, and so forth. But I think there's another important element here, and one that I've sort of talked around. It's really the point of this particular video episode, this video series, if it becomes a series. And that's the idea that the Slender Man is a myth, that he is mythological, that there is a mythos. That's what I mean by myth. I don't mean myth in the sense of a Mythbusters myth that can be broken. He is mythological. And that is important, and it's something that I think that a lot of the news outlets aren't drawing attention to, and with good reason. They have a short amount of time to talk about this story in the simplest terms. But a closer look needs talking about this, requires talking about this. When I say a myth, I'm not trying to say that as a contrast to reality. He is a myth rather than a real person. I'm saying that in contrast to fictional characters. Dracula is a fictional character based on a historical figure, but a fictional character. But the vampire is a myth. Right? Slimer in the Ghostbusters movies or cartoons or whatever, that's a character. Ghosts are a myth. Slender Man feels like a character because you say Slender Man and not a Slender Man or one of the Slender Men or something like that. But he's not. He's a myth. He is something very ill-defined. In fact, even if you look at people who have made great investments into telling Slender Man stories, like the people behind the video game, Parsec Studios, I think is their name, or Marble Hornets, one of the earliest and longest running of the ARGs. And if you sit down and ask them, what does the Slender Man do? Where does he come from? What is he even? Their stories, at least, don't reveal that to any great extent. He's extremely mysterious, and the facts that we know about him are only sort of consensual, observable factors. Motivations or background, history, origins, all of that has been very conspicuously absent in the Slender Man mythology. And that's great. That's what makes a mythology rich and meaningful. You have stories about a thing, but that thing itself is ill-defined. And that's what gives it a sense of reality. You know fictional characters aren't real, or you probably know fictional characters aren't real, but you may or may not know whether mythological things are real. Or you may think they used to be real, but they aren't anymore. Or they once weren't real, but they've become real because of what people believe. Those sorts of things. Alright, so how does this all weigh in on the question of these girls being influenced by the Slender Man? And I don't mean influenced in a supernatural way. I mean being influenced by this mythos. Well, this is where it gets particularly interesting, I would argue. And it has to do with the fact that when you are receptive to a myth, you measure that receptivity, the influence it has over you, by the marks it leaves in your life. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you believe in the myth of Santa Claus, you measure that myth by the fact that you receive gifts and are not told who they're from, or are told specifically they're from Santa. Or you perhaps leave out cookies, and those cookies are eaten when you come down in the morning. Those are very traditional markers of the Santa Claus myth. And in fact, by the way, all of our traditional myths, in the United States particularly, have this sort of exchange factor to them. The myth of the tooth fairy, you know because you leave a tooth and you receive some money. The myth of the Easter bunny, you know because you receive these eggs in an egg hunt, or perhaps a basket or something like that from the Easter bunny. All of these sorts of myths have material markers to them. And in fact, if you were to find a kid who believed genuinely in these things and said, how would you prove the Easter bunny existed? I can almost guarantee you that that child would answer in terms of those actions, in terms of those markers. So you would say, I sneak down and I see Santa leaving presents. I sneak out and I see the Easter bunny hiding a basket, or something like that. The question isn't going to be about, well, I find other bunnies who know the Easter bunny and interview them or something. It doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the Easter bunny's life. The only thing that matters is that marker that touches your life. And in fact, once those things are rather easily disproven, when your parents reveal that they've been doing all this, that breaks down the mythology and so forth. Well, that same kind of rubric goes for whatever we're talking about. Say we're talking about gods, ancient gods. And we use this phrase, God of the gaps, to refer to the idea that gods typically do the things that humans don't have the ability to explain. So we imagine an ancient world where people can't explain lightning, and they believe that God is responsible for lightning. That's a measurable experiential marker of that mythology. I believe that Zeus exists because I can see thunder and hear thunder, see lightning, and I know that that comes from Zeus or Thor or whatever. So carry this over into mythological monsters. We'll take three. I think these are probably the most famous, at least in English-speaking culture, but they're certainly famous enough that everybody should be familiar with them. Take a ghost, a vampire, a werewolf. And think about the markers, the experiential markers that these kinds of creatures would leave on you. If you experience a werewolf, it means, presumably, in fact, given most of the narratives we have, you're going to be attacked, right? Or something is going to be attacked. Your dog is going to be attacked. Your vehicle is going to be attacked. And it's going to be something physical. Werewolves are physical myths. They're about physical monsters with physical claws and physical fangs and physical fur and that sort of thing. And that's really unlikely that you're ever going to experience that. You take a vampire, there's a certain middle ground to it. There's a very physical element to the vampire, the idea of the penetrating bite and sucking out your life force and things like that. But there's also this much more emotional component, the idea that vampires might be able to sway your moods or read your mind or compel you to do something, or that draining of your life will be seductive and pleasurable, or will be perhaps the exact opposite, very draining and detrimental and so forth. And then if you go to the other end of the spectrum and have a ghost, most of these sorts of stories are going to be about very subtle experiences. The idea of a cold spot, the idea of seeing a shadow move, the idea of hearing a noise you can't explain. Often feelings are involved, the idea of being depressed or being unusually tired or being suddenly nauseous, things like that as measurable experiences of a ghost. Now you can look at that spectrum that I've laid out for you, ghost and vampire and werewolf, and see that the things that are markers of a ghost are very easy to experience. You will see shadows move that you can't explain. You will hear noises you can't explain. You will sometimes feel queasy, and you will sometimes feel tired, and you will sometimes notice temperature changes because that's the world. On the other end of the spectrum, you're very unlikely to be attacked by a creature you can't recognize and no one else can explain. It could conceivably happen, but it's very unlikely. And so, the whole build-up being in aid of this particular equation here, when you look at those three mythological creatures, what you're going to find is a lot of people believe in ghosts, far fewer people believe in vampires as real things that exist in our world, and far fewer believe in werewolves. And it's because of the markers. You can conjure a ghost with your imagination. It's much harder to conjure a werewolf, or to extend it even further, a dragon or something like that. You just don't have the incoming perceptions to make up that story very easily. You might, in fact, if you are profoundly mentally unstable, you may conjure up all sorts of things. But a normal person can imagine a ghost very easily being in their presence. This is build up for saying the Slender Man is the same sort of way. The Slender Man stories, they involve, yes, seeing the Slender Man, but that's often only part of a much larger set of components. This feeling of being watched, sickness, sort of respiratory sickness usually, or a general sort of radiation sickness. The idea of lost time, lost memories, false memories, things experienced in the wrong order. All of these, except for seeing the Slender Man, all of these other things are internal experiences. And in fact, they're the kind of internal experiences that you can very easily imagine a pre-adolescent child having and not knowing how to manage, especially if it is someone who has actual, sort of treatable, diagnosable mental issues, which we don't know in this case, honestly. In fact, just today, the girl who did the stabbing is being taken in for assessment on exactly that question. So where does this leave us in terms of the story? Well, when we have a mythos that really preys on this sort of emotional and psychological menace, and you have people who, either because of age, disposition, actual organic sorts of disabilities, or something, are susceptible to these particular kinds of narratives, these particular kinds of frameworks for the emotional and psychological menace they may experience in their own lives quite naturally, that's when you get a situation like this. And by the way, I've seen some stories really trying to play this as a product of the internet. Pardon me. The idea that the internet feeds all these sort of dark things into children's minds and they're not able to sort them out and so forth. And that may be a legitimate argument. But this is part of a much larger phenomenon. We can think about something like the Crusades in the Middle Ages and individuals being promised a place in heaven if they're willing to go kill people in another country. You can certainly attribute this to some forms of radical terrorism where religious promises are made. You will have an afterlife reward if you kill yourself in service of a certain cause and so forth. Either simple self-destruction or killing others but with your own death. That's the same thing. That is, I imagine there is something out there that will reward me if I'm willing to hurt other humans. In whether it's the Slender Man or whether it's the kingdom of heaven or whether it is virgins in heaven or something like that, doesn't matter. And by the way, in every one of those cases, most of the world doesn't think that's true. That is a minority opinion in every example. That most of the world has other things that they believe, don't misunderstand, but the diversity of these beliefs, there's no majority anywhere in the world in terms of belief systems. So, seeing somebody influenced by this kind of behavior, it's shocking, it's newsworthy, it's titillating, it's exciting, right? But it's not that rare for a human, or it's not that out of the norm of human behavior, and it's one of the things that myths do. It makes us hurt people sometimes because we believe that there's something beyond us that wants us to do it. Alright, well, that's really kind of long and maybe a little rambly, although I think I stayed on topic. I did go on a little longer than I intended. So, here's the deal. If you like this video, obviously like this video. If you want to subscribe, obviously subscribe. If you think anyone else would like it, share. You know all that because you know about YouTube. But, seriously, if this is something you'd like to see more of, I don't need to know that particularly, but if you have any questions that you want dealt with that have to do with mythos systems, put them in the comments. I'd love to see them. I would love to respond to them. I would love to have those provoke some of my own thoughts and considerations of this topic. I have a few more already in mind, maybe another 3 or 4 episodes that I may very well make, whether there are questions or not. But then from there on, if there seems to be an interest, I'll gladly pursue this. I genuinely don't know that anyone will ever see this. It may simply slip into the YouTube void, never to be heard from again. But if it isn't, and if it doesn't, then I'll be here again, maybe in a week or so, to talk about some other mythos systems and what they mean and what we can do with that information. Hope you enjoyed this, and perhaps I'll see you again then.